Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you, who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Phillimore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 330, Breakfasts at Baker Street. Hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you great?
Why, yes, Tony, I am great. Thanks very much.
Well, you're part of a well-balanced breakfast.
I've always thought I was the toast rack in the breakfast of life.
Hey, everybody needs a good toast rack.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. Now, the idea, though, behind the toast rack, I mean, I understand it from a standpoint of elegant service, but it does have the effect of accelerating the degree to which your breakfast toast becomes cold.
Well, it does, but let's. I mean, it's a trade-off, isn't it? Because if you just take your toast out of the toaster and lay it down on your plate, you get that undercarriage of steam that builds up on your plate. So you get soggy toast in that case versus standing it up in the rack, in which case you get cold toast.
Well, look, I don't want to argue with you, but let me argue with you. First of all, I don't have any steam in my undercarriage, buddy. And second, this is an opportunity for entrepreneurs. What you're missing here is the fact that we should be immediately contacting manufacturers in China to build a heated toast rack.
I remember there was a column that Alistair Cook wrote. Remember, he, of course, was...
yes, Letter from America.
Gentleman, yes. He was over in Great Britain. He was in
New York.
The host of... Yeah, and he would write back and forth. He was the host of Masterpiece Theater at one point.
Yeah, he lived in Manhattan. Yeah, he lived in Manhattan for years and wrote his letters to America from America.
He said, from the day I settled permanently in this country, I naturally tried to do in Rome as the Romans did. When in my early days at Yale, I wondered if there might be a toast rack handy. The nice English professor I was breakfasting with, very gently, almost confidentially, told me, they don't exist.
Here, they don't exist in America. Well, now they do. You can buy them on Amazon.
Yeah, you can buy them pretty much anywhere. But Mark Twain, he said, on his first visit to England, that's the first time he encountered a toast rack. And he said... He wrote, I should say, in the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, it took the mechanical genius of the English to devise a receptacle which guaranteed to deliver the shortest possible time toast that was both cold and hard. So there you have it. So your toast is not only cold, but is hard rather than soggy.
Yeah.
Courtesy of Mark Twain.
Well, I like that. So now we should be putting out the Sam Clemens toast rack, clearly. We should be marketing this.
The Sherlock Holmes brand toast rack.
And I've got the perfect tagline, your toast, cold and hard. And we don't charge extra for that.
Well, enough about this. Let's make sure we get into the actual content of the show here. If you'd like the show notes for this episode, they're going to be available at ihose.co/trifles330. That'll take you directly to our website where you can look up any links we have. You can also sign up for email updates or even support us on Patreon. There's a Patreon link there, or right in the show notes here where you happen to be listening to us. And, I was asked the other day by a listener, where do you prefer us to listen to you? On which platforms do you prefer us to listen to you? And my response was quite candid. We don't care. Wherever you get your podcasts, if you prefer listening to us on YouTube, that's fine. Just know that you're not going to get a video. It's just the sound file delivered via YouTube, but it's a handy way to do it. We're also on Spotify, of course, on Apple Podcasts, and virtually any other of the major platforms. So feel free to pick and choose to your heart's content where you bring trifles with you. Well, we're talking about breakfast at Baker Street in this episode. And I wanted to mention that we did have a number of episodes previously where we talked about food in the Canon. We took you on a variety of journeys, both in restaurants and looking at particular types of food. And we do have a playlist available in our show notes. You can find those. That'll be playing through the SoundCloud platform that we have there. But just as a reminder, some of the episodes that we talked about with regard to food before, we talked about Simpsons, where Holmes and Watson dine. We talked about the supper that they laid out in the Naval Treaty. We talked about Holmes's dining habits, as peculiar as they were. We talked about British food overall. We talked about vegetarians in the Victorian world. And finally, we talked about buffets, as were listed in various railway establishments. So there's about 6 episodes there that you can listen to related to food. But in this case, we wanted to take up the recommendation of listener Bob Hanmer, who said, why don't you talk about breakfast in the Canon? And I have to admit, Bert, I could only remember one breakfast in particular in the stories. And I'm sure it's the same one that you know off the top of your head.
Yes, well, it's the one breakfast that's absolutely central to the story, and it's a major event, and it's also one that tells you a lot about Sherlock Holmes's character, and it's just a lot of fun to read.
It certainly is. I mean, the climax there, as Holmes and Watson are seated at the breakfast table, and Mrs. Hudson comes in with the tray, and Holmes says, "Mrs. Hudson has risen to the occasion." Said Holmes, uncovering a dish of curried chicken. Her cuisine is a little limited, but she has as good an idea of breakfast as a Scotch woman. What have you there, Watson? Oh, ham and eggs, I answered. Good. What are you going to take, Mr. Phelps? Curried fowl or eggs? Or will you help yourself? Of course, that's when Percy Phelps took the cover off the dish and found the Naval Treaty, which was a little odd in terms of serving for breakfast. I would have thought the Naval Treaty would have been much better as a dinner entree.
No, you're thinking of a tureen. This was a paper treaty. Tureen of agreement. Well, it's a terrific topic, and the interesting thing is that if you start thinking about breakfast in the Canon, you wind up wondering about the habits and the hours and what a day was like in the Baker Street sitting room. Because breakfast, the hours you could get breakfast in Baker Street are certainly irregular, if anybody had breakfast at all. So, Watson tells us at one point that late breakfasts are typical because Holmes, he says, in The Speckled Band, Holmes was a late riser as a rule. Now, of course, in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, we will see many examples that fly in the face of Holmes being a late riser in the rule. But in any case, in the band, he says, Watson, Holmes was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions where he stayed up all night. And Watson then admitted, enjoying the habit of sleeping late, because in the Boscombe Valley Mystery, we find him married and he's very busy and he's lingering at the breakfast table and it's 11:45 in the morning.
Oh, goodness. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, clearly not a busy day for Watson. And really, we're given that idea fairly early on. Very early on in A Study in Scarlet. He says, it was upon the 4th of March, as I have good reason to remember, that I rose somewhat earlier than usual and found that Sherlock Holmes had not yet finished his breakfast. The landlady had become so accustomed to my late habits that my place had not been laid, nor my coffee prepared. With the unreasonable petulance of mankind, I rang the bell and gave a curt intimation that I was ready. Then I picked up a magazine from the table and attempted to while away the time with it, while my companion munched silently at his toast.
And these inconsistencies are wonderful because in The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb, we find, this is a case where the unfortunate Victor Hatherley is brought to Watson very early in the morning, and he takes him over to Sherlock Holmes. And so when he gets to Baker Street, he and Hatherley find Holmes prepared to have breakfast, but it's just a little after 7 o'clock in the morning. And then, we have all these other bits of information about Holmes's breakfast habits. He smokes his before breakfast pipe of all the plugs and dottles left over from his smokes the day before. And on this morning, it's 7 o'clock in Baker Street, and here's Hatherley with a bleeding hand. And what does Watson do? He orders fresh rashers and eggs. Oh, no, Holmes does that. Fresh rashers and eggs, and prepares to join Dr. Watson and his numb victim in a hearty meal.
Well, and that was considerate of him because, of course, the injured Hatherley there would have been lightheaded after having lost some blood. Holmes very thoughtfully orders that repast that allows him to refresh, recharge, and quite frankly, just gain his composure. And here's the kicker. So they have breakfast, and hopefully at that point, Hatherley was feeling a little better. But Watson says, when it was concluded, it being breakfast, he settled our new acquaintance upon the sofa, placed a pillow beneath his head, and laid a glass of brandy and water within his reach. Now, that's what I call a fine chaser to breakfast. Sounds more like a brunch to me. He laid a mimosa within his reach.
Laid a mimosa.
A Bloody Mary or a Bloody Victor would have been much more appropriate during that
right.
time.
I'll have a Bloody Engineer. Now there's a name for a cocktail. I'll have a Bloody Engineer.
We could make a book of cocktails and do a Bloody Mary, but instead of a stalk of celery, just put a little gummy thumb in there or something like that.
Oh. Well, we do talk from time to time about that cocktail book, and I was just talking to Charlie Blankstein at the Sons of the Copper Beaches about that too. So there's a group of us who are interested in these
good
cocktaily Baker Street.
We'll have to discuss it over brunch sometime.
Well, and there are more inconsistencies in the canon, or interesting things that sort of speak to breakfast in the canon. So, for example, in the Speckled Band, all of the major events, where Grimsby Roylott shows up and so on at Baker Street, happen before breakfast. So you've got Grimsby Roylott, he bends the poker, Holmes bends it back, and then he sits down, I think, to breakfast. And it's all very unpredictable. In The Retired Colorman, Watson comes down and he observes eggshells and toast crumbs as evidence that Holmes was there before him. So, it's quite a variety.
Yeah, it really is. Well, why don't we stop for a variety of information from our sponsor? We'll be right back. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. Okay, we're back, and I hope you have ginned up an appetite, because we're going to continue to talk about breakfast at Baker Street. You know, you were talking about these inconsistencies, Bert, and I think one of them so first of all, we see toast and coffee mentioned an awful lot. There's certainly accompaniments to larger meals, but sometimes that seems to be the only thing on the menu. For example, in A Scandal in Bohemia, there was a sleepover. Watson said, "I slept at Baker Street that night, and we were engaged upon our toast and coffee in the morning when the King of Bohemia rushed into the room." So
that's right.
just a little something to get them going in the morning. Similarly, in the Valley of Fear, this was after they discovered there was a dumbbell missing from Burleston. Watson writes of Holmes, "He sat with his mouth full of toast and his eyes sparkling with mischief, watching my intellectual entanglement. The mere sight of his excellent appetite was an assurance of success." And then he goes on and on about earlier recollections of Holmes losing his appetite after nights and nights of chasing down clues. So it seems that munching on toast, just as we saw Holmes in the earlier stories, seems to be consistent throughout. But it's interesting in Black Peter, which actually does have a pretty good breakfast. We've got Stanley Hopkins at the ready, and he, of course, is working on this case of the murder of Peter Cairns, who was pinned to his wall of his cabin with a harpoon. And Holmes was busy signing people up for for some kind of duty. And the next morning, Hopkins comes over, and Holmes is still engaged in this exercise. And he says, "I really must apologize, Hopkins. I fear that the scrambled eggs are cold. However, you'll enjoy the rest of your breakfast all the better, will you not, for the thought that you've brought your case to a triumphant conclusion." So I mention this because there's a wonderful book that Julia Rosenblatt and Fritz Sonnenschmidt published or wrote in, I guess this was in the 1970s. And it's in connection with a series of dinners that used to be put on. And you've got a history with these dinners, Bert, so maybe you might provide a little bit of an introduction. Then we can go back to the Stanley Hopkins breakfast.
Well, I have to rely on my memory here, and I know it sounds stupid, but these things happened so long ago. My memory is I was at the first one, and I do have a copy of the original book, Dining with Sherlock Holmes, which came out some years after the first dinner at the Culinary Institute. And I'm certain that I was at the last one, which was in 2001. I'm pretty sure I didn't make any. I think there were a total of 5. Were there 5 or 6?
I think that sounds about right. They did them about every 5 years or so, if I recall correctly. I never got to attend one, but it was, as you say, at the Culinary Institute of America up in Rhinebeck.
And you can chart the progress not only of the Culinary Institute of America, but also of Fritz Sonnenschmidt, who over the years became a master chef. And the book, which was reprinted in 1990, also in that version, in that edition, has copies of the menus in the back. So if you're interested in Victorian cuisine and you want to recreate all of these recipes for things mentioned in the canon, things like oat cakes and pâté de foie gras pie, which we've talked about in the past, and dozens and dozens and dozens more, cockaliki soup and Yorkshire pudding and all sorts of things, the authentic recipes by a master chef like Fritz Sonnenschmidt and Julia, you could do no better than this.
Indeed. And the Stanley Hopkins breakfast says the case had taken them away from Baker Street to Woodman's Lee. Having returned to their comfortable lodgings, the pair invited Detective Stanley Hopkins to join them for breakfast. Mrs. Hudson had prepared an excellent breakfast for 9:30 a.m. The detective arrived on time, but the meal was delayed until the three prospective diners had interviewed and handcuffed the murderer of the sea captain. And that's where Holmes apologizes for the cold scrambled eggs. Now, the good news is when you make these recipes that they've laid out here, which include grilled grapefruit with ginger, scrambled eggs with grilled mushrooms and ham, oat cakes, orange marmalade, and coffee, when you make them yourself, you can choose to enjoy the scrambled eggs either hot or cold, depending on your preferences. But I was interested in the oat cakes because that actually brings to mind a very trifling reference to buckwheat cakes in A Study in Scarlet. And that comes from, it looks like the American chapters, where we have John Ferrier taking care of Lucy. And he says, I'll tell her how awful good you've been. I'll bet she meets us at the door of heaven with a big pitcher of water and a lot of buckwheat cakes, hot and toasted on both sides, like Bob and me was fond of. How long will it be first?
That's interesting.
Buckwheat cakes, like oat cakes. Those must be like pancakes, I would imagine.
Well, I don't know. I've never seen a recipe for buckwheat cakes. I don't even know what the definition is of buckwheat compared to contemporary flour and wheat and so on.
Well, I believe the contemporary rating of them was they were ote.
Ote. Well, I was intrigued too by oat cakes because I had never thought about it is like a pancake of some sort, but I had, although they are firm and crisp. And anyway, here you've got a recipe, a very nice and simple recipe. You too can make 8 oat cakes and add them to your breakfast repertoire.
There you go. Well, before we trifle out here, just wanted to make a quick acknowledgement. In addition to Bob Hanmer being so helpful with his recommendation for this topic, and by the way, Bob, we're going to be sending you something from the iHose vaults to thank you for the recommendation. And we do welcome recommendations from any of our listeners. Just simply hit us up at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. But I also wanted to mention that Eric Deckers wrote to us. Eric may be a familiar name to listeners of I Hear of Sherlock everywhere, but he listened to episode 328, where we talked about cudgels, among other things. I don't know if you recall the rest of that episode, but we were talking about weapons in the canon. But he said, I was listening to Trifles and loved your impromptu ad for cudgels. Friends, do you often find yourself on the wrong end of a ruffian's fist? Do you need a club that doesn't require membership? Are you in need of a non-lethal weapon that's difficult to fit in your pocket? Then you need a Sherlock Holmes brand cudgel. Made from the stoutest English oak, our cudgels have been hardened by fire and tested on and by the world's most incorrigible of London's criminals. And only Sherlock Holmes brand cudgels carry the 3 C's. Clear, concussive, clobbering. So if you need a self-defense weapon that carries some real clout, get your Sherlock Holmes brand cudgels today.
Oh, that's fabulous. That is really fabulous.
Oh, our fans are the best.
Yeah.
They are the best.
Great to add that to the product inventory.
And as we do at the end of every month, we have a drawing now where we are going to put all of the names of our Patreon supporters into a revolving drum. Or is that the big prize wheel? I'm not sure exactly which. But either way, we're going to give it a spin. And we will randomly choose a name out of here who will win a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. And the number I have that came up here is number 13, and that goes to Matthew Karn. Congratulations, Matt. We'll be getting you a copy of the Baker Street Journal, back issue of the Baker Street Journal. So thank you for your support. If you'd like to join Matt and the rest of the lucky patrons, just make sure you go to our Patreon page in the show notes. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Oh, thank you for your many considerations.
A Scotswoman's breakfast, indeed. A silly bit of paper.